Today is 3rd October, marking the last day of the 4th month of Ukraine's counteroffensive, a counteroffensive that began on the 4th of June. Tomorrow, 4th October, we will be starting the 5th month. So we've had 4 months of counteroffensive, intense fighting, hundreds of tanks destroyed, thousands of men killed, and as the New York Times confirmed in an article about a week ago, the situation on the front lines remains virtually unchanged from what it was before the offensive began, at least in those parts of the front lines where Ukraine itself has been attacking. There's been no breakthrough to the south, towards Tokmak and Melitopol, or the Sea of Azov. The fighting in and around Bakhmut, or I should say around Bakhmut, the Ukrainians have never actually managed to reach the town itself, but the fighting around Bakhmut has come to a stop. Effectively, the Ukrainians there are in a state of stalemate, and in the Vremivka salient, the Ukrainians failed to achieve a breakthrough either. As the New York Times rather grudgingly admitted, in terms of actual territory, measured in terms of square miles, the Russians have actually gained more ground this year than the Ukrainians. And of course, one should not overlook the fact that over the course of the fighting this year, the Russians gained what was a significant town, Bakhmut, whereas all that the Ukrainians have to show up to this point is a small collection of deserted villages. So this is not by any stretch of the imagination up to this point any sort of success. And in fact, as I've been discussing in various programs recently, the level of the fighting appears to have ebbed, even in the Bakhmut area, where, contrary to many reports, it has been overall the most intense. Right across the area where Ukraine has been seeking to conduct its offensive, there's been a significant reduction in the amount of fighting. Now, there is still the tantalizing question of whether Ukraine is going to attempt one last big throw, launch an attack across the Dnipro River, try to land forces on the east bank, advance presumably towards Crimea across Kherson, a very ambitious operation, and according to some reports, or Rybar, for example, the Ukrainians now have deployed 9,500 Marines on the west bank of Kherson region, and there's 15,000 troops in reserve. So this, on the face of it, is a significant force of around 25,000 men. They won't all land, obviously, at the same time, but it's a significant force that has been deployed in this area in order to mount this assault across the Dnipro River. But I noticed that in his very latest report, Rybar said that Ukraine is unlikely yet to have made a final decision on whether to do this. For the moment, the Ukrainians are still trying to gain control of the various villages, of the various islands of the Dnipro River. There's been intense fighting right from the start of this offensive, even before, for control of these islands, and Ukraine has up to now failed to consolidate fully its control of these islands. And anyway, Rybar doesn't seem to think that that decision will be made before at least 2 weeks have passed. Now, 2 weeks takes us to the middle of October. I'm not fully familiar with weather forecasting in this area, but I've heard multiple claims that the temperature across southern Ukraine is now falling. that there's more rain, and in fact the expectation is that from about 2 weeks' time, the weather will turn decisively towards autumn. Now, I'm not an expert in these matters. I'm no expert in river crossings against defended, fortified positions on the other bank. I've heard repeated claims that this is one of the most difficult and complex operations for an army to carry out, and I would have thought that waiting 2 weeks until the weather is bad before attempting to do it is problematic, to say the least. It might even be a recipe for disaster. Anyway, putting aside this rather tantalizing question of whether or not Ukraine really does intend to launch this very ambitious and very complicated and extremely risky operation across the Dnipro River, one in which, by the way, failure would be impossible to conceal, including from the Ukrainian people. Well, putting that aside, the totality of reports about the situation on the battlefronts all confirm the same thing, which is that pretty much everywhere the Russians are now on the attack, not in large numbers, not very aggressively. We're not talking about any kind of offensive at the moment, but pretty much everywhere. It is the Russians now who are attacking and who are gaining ground. If we turn first to the Orechov area, to Rabotino and Zaporozhye, we've now had comments from our old friend Vladimir Rogov of the Zaporozhye, of the Russian-controlled part of Zaporozhye. He's chairman of the We Stand With Russia movement, whatever that is. But anyway, he's clearly somebody who has some kind of official or semi-official role, and he often acts as a spokesman, from what I can see, for the regional authorities in Zaporozhye, and he's obviously very well informed about the situation on the battlefronts. And anyway, this is what he says. He says the enemy had made attempts to advance towards Orekhovo near Verbovoye, in order to break through to Novoprokopovka before we counterattacked near Rabotino. Now, this is clearly a bit scrambled, because what he means is that the Ukrainians tried to push south from Orekhovo towards Novoprokopovka. This is a rather small town south of Rabotino. And this is the area where the Ukrainians have indeed been trying to push through to this town. They need to capture this town if they are ever to reach the Surovikin line on the direct line to Tokmak. So they've been trying to capture Verbovoye, and they haven't been successful, and they've been trying to push southeast of Rabotino towards this town of Novoprokopovka. But Rogov says that the Russians counterattacked near Rabotino. And he goes on to say a certain degree of success has been made as our troops have advanced several hundred meters forward. We have pushed the front line a few hundred meters forward. And Ukrainian troops attempted to attack Russian positions last night and in the early hours of Tuesday in the direction of the Vremevka salient. We have moved forward by several hundred kilometers in battles near Urozhainoye. We can claim that the territory under our control and the grey zone has been expanded both in the Orekhovo direction and near the Vremevka salient. And TASS says that he said this with confidence. And in fact, we've had other reports of a similar sort, perhaps rather more detailed. For example, Yuri Podolyaka Another Russian commentator is in effect saying the same thing. He says that the Russians have been carrying out successful attacks in and around Rabotino. There's more fighting inside the village, apparently, as the Russians have been moving troops into it. They've also been pressing the Ukrainians to the west of the village. They've been less successful, apparently, in pushing the Ukrainians back from near Verbovoye. But overall, in the Rabotino, Verbovoye area, it's clear that the Russians have been undertaking some kind of advance. And of course, he says, and he goes on to say that in the Vremevka salient area, matters have gone much further than that. He says that the Russians are pushing forward in various places. They've now taken the two villages of Staromayorsk and Urozhainoye into a semicircle. And there is, well, maybe not a project by the Russians to actually recapture these two villages, which Ukraine claimed to have captured in August, but at any rate to push the Ukrainians back significantly in this area. And that, of course, chimes with what Vladimir Rogov is saying. And lastly, we've had from Podolyaka a brief account of what's going on in the Bakhmut area. Here again, the Russians have been mounting counterattacks in the Klesheyevka area, pushing the Ukrainians back inside this village. He says that the Russian approach, given the lack of cover after the essential destruction of these two villages of Andreevka and Klesheyevka, is to mount what might be called hit-and-run attacks, and then they retreat back to their fortified positions along the railway line, which bisects Klesheyevka apparently at its eastern end. So that's what he says there. Doesn't say much more about events further north of the former Bakhmut. There's been intense fighting, as I've discussed, over several programs in and around the village of Orekhovo-Vasilyevka. The Russian Defense Ministry has still not said that this village has been captured. It's clear that it remains contested. But again, the overwhelming consensus of reports from this part of the battlefield suggests that the Russians have, in fact, made significant advances and that they control the bulk of this village, if not the entirety of it. And there have been some further reports about the Russians increasing pressure in near Avdiivka, this town near Donetsk city, which is the center of Ukrainian positions near Donetsk city, and one continues to get scattered reports about more further Russian advances, a continued Russian clear-up of whatever is left of the Ukrainian positions in Marinka, south of Avdiivka. And further north still, around Kupiansk, the Oskol River line, the Kremenaya, Svatovo area, Liman, that part of the northern front. Again, lots of reports of incremental, small Russian advances, Russian missile and air strikes and drone strikes, very heavy strikes on Ukrainian positions. The bridges over the Oskol River have been destroyed in this area. The Russians still have not mounted, however, any sustained ground offensive that I can see, but it does seem that they are gradually, systematically, methodically pushing forward. So this is not an offensive. The Russians are not, so far, engaging in any kind of offensive on the battle fronts. What they're continuing to do, or so it seems to me, is exhaust Ukrainian forces, exhaust their reserves, draw in their reserves, weaken the Ukrainians, continue to conduct attrition, preparing the ground for whatever is to come eventually when the Russian General Staff and the political leadership in Moscow make that decision. Now, going back to the question of the Ukrainian build-up on the West Bank of the Dnipro in Kherson region, there's quite a lot of discussion about what Ukrainian intentions are. Rybar says that the Ukrainians themselves haven't made a final decision. Others, notably Brian Beletic, he floated this as a possibility in a program we did yesterday with Danny Haifong, Alex Christoforou and me. Brian Beletic suggested that this build-up on the West Bank of the Dnipro is intended to divert Russian forces from the Orekhov, Rabotino, Verbovoye area, and that if there is going to be a big Ukrainian attack, that is where it will come. And that might, by the way, be correct. As I said, a contested river crossing in autumn hardly seems to me like a good idea. But of course, piling up troops, mainly, by the way, exhausted and broken down troops. I mean, these Ukrainian Marines have been fighting bitter battles for many months now. One of these brigades, one of these Ukrainian Marine brigades, was the brigade that fought in Mariupol and was largely captured by the Russian military. Most of its men went into captivity. A lot of them have been exchanged. The brigade has been reconstituted, but then it was then thrown back into the battle. And it was thrown back into the battle in the Vremivka salient area. And of course, the other three brigades have also been fighting intensely there. And if Rybar is correct, and we're talking about 9,500 troops, then it seems to me that the brigades are by now seriously under strength, and the men who make them up must be pretty exhausted. But anyway, it could be that this build-up on the West Bank with these tired troops is not really intended for a contested river crossing, especially over the Dnipro, into the fortified and heavily mined positions that the Russians will by now have created on the East Bank. Any damage, by the way, caused by the flooding of the Novaya Kakhovka after the Novaya Kakhovka dam was destroyed back in June, will by now have been repaired or replaced in terms of these fortifications. They may have been reconfigured in various ways, but the Russians are certain to have restored whatever minefields and defenses they had in that area. It could be that the Ukrainians have no real plan to carry out this operation, and that they are indeed trying to draw the Russians away and to draw the Russians' attention away from the Verbovoye, Rabotino sector. And if there is going to be a last big attack, that is where it may come. There is, or so it seems to me, a third possibility, and that is that there's too much analysing of this build-up taking place. The three tactical groups that the Ukrainians have created, supposedly to carry out this river crossing, have been given rather resplendent names: Normandy, Omaha, and Thunder. And it does give to this whole build-up a rather theatrical or even cinematic appearance. We go back to what my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou said many months ago, before the Ukrainian offensive even began, that the whole planning and approach to the offensive made it look like more the script for a Hollywood movie than a properly trained military operation. And I've seen that various media outlets, and by the way, Zelensky himself, have since adopted this particular simile. So, could it be that the labelling of these forces, the redeployment of these forces, the giving to them of these resplendent names, harking back to the successful Allied landing in Normandy on the 4th of June 1944, could it be that all of this is again more theatre? It's to prevent people saying that the offensive is indeed ended, that it has failed to achieve anything. Might it be that it's just intended to keep us all discussing and speculating about what the Ukrainian plans are, and not to talk about the failure of the offensive, rather than have any real serious intention behind it? Well, I'm not saying that is the case. I mean, I don't know. I don't know what Zelensky and his officials and the Ukrainian General Staff are saying to each other. But if that is the case, given how this war and this offensive has been conducted from the Ukrainian side up to this point, well, it would not surprise me. Anyway, let's move away from the battlefronts and start talking about what various people are saying. Now, the Russian Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu, has given another report about the state of the war. He's held a teleconference with the leadership of the Russian armed forces. There is a rather striking a series of photographs, and it shows that Shoigu has been addressing Russia's main battle headquarters, this extraordinary modern facility that the Russians have created. They've seen pictures of it during the Syrian conflict. We've seen more photographs of it since then. We have rows of military officers sitting in front of banks of computers and other things. Apparently, it's only the part of the war room that we are actually shown. There is an even more sophisticated war room, perhaps with holographic images and all those sort of things. But anyway, it all looks very high-tech and very modern, and there is a raised area, a kind of veranda located above this war room, and right at the top we have Shoigu talking and addressing the Russian soldiers. So it's not just the Defense Ministry board that Shoigu is addressing. He is addressing the entire brains of the Russian military, the General Staff, the various liaison people, the people who, in other words, operate Russia's military headquarters. What once upon a time the Russians would have called Stavka, the High Command. And the Russian Defense Ministry has published again a summary of his words, and this is extracts. I'm now going to read extracts from it. This is taken directly from the Russian Defense Ministry's website, and again I'm using their translation into English. Today, that's to say 3rd October, the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation has held a teleconference with the senior staff of the armed forces at the National Center for State Defense Control in Moscow. As I said, what once would have been the Stavka, called the Stavka. General of the Army, Sergei Shoigu, started his address with the situation in the special military operation. Russian troops have significantly weakened the enemy's combat potential and inflicted serious damage. The south group of forces have repelled all attacks in the Soledar-Bakhmut direction. Servicemen of the 4th Motorized Brigade, the 11th Air Assault Brigade, and the 17th Artillery Brigade particularly distinguished themselves. So he's now talking about the Bakhmut area, and he also has some very gracious things to say about the Chechen forces, who are also concentrated in this area. Further down in the summary, he says the Chechen Republic and its head, Ramzan Kadyrov, personally deserve special mention in all 3 motorized rifle regiments and 3 motorized rifle battalions were formed in the Republic. The units under the command of the hero of Russia, Abdi Alaudinov, performed with distinction in the special military operation. More than 14,500 people have been trained at the Russian Special Forces University in Gudermes, which is, by the way, in the Chechen Republic, and sent to the special military operation zone. The timely replacement of personnel involved in combat operations is made possible by the training system established in this region, in other words, in Chechnya. So the Chechens are fighting, they're playing a big role in the Bakhmut operation. He came in for special mention, but Shoigu is also careful to mention Russian forces. He speaks about the 4th Motorized Rifle Brigade, the 11th Air Assault Brigade, and the 17th Artillery Brigade. And then Shoigu continues, the enemy's attempts to break through Russian defense near Verbovoye and Rabotino in Zaporozhye direction met with no success. The 70th Motorized Rifle Regiment and the 56th Air Assault Regiment, as well as the 810th Marine Brigade and the 291st Artillery Brigade, successfully completed their missions. So these are the forces that originally defended in Rabotino and Verbovoye. We're told that they successfully completed their missions, and presumably that means they've been withdrawn and re-equipped. And we happen to know that now it is forces from the 76th Airborne Guards Division of the Russian Airborne Forces and other such forces that are conducting the defences and indeed now the attacks in the Rabotino-Verbovoye area. And then Shoigu has much to say about the troops who have been decorated, that there's been large numbers of Russian troops who have received decorations, and he talks about the situation he talks about the medical situation. He said that there was a good level of medical support for the military. Servicemen are provided with first aid on the battlefield within the first few minutes after being wounded. Field hospitals, reinforced by experienced surgeons from Central Medical Services, have been set up in the immediate vicinity of the line of contact. Wounded survivability rate has been greatly improved, with rapid on-site help, timely evacuation, and high-tech medical care. More than 98% of casualties are discharged with full recovery. The hospital mortality rate is 0.43% and continues to decrease. Military medics show professionalism and courage, perform unique operations, saving the lives and health of Russian fighters. Now that's what Shoigu says. I don't see any reason to dispute his statistics. I've seen no suggestion on any Russian media or social media site or Telegram channel that would lead one to think that these claims about Russian troops receiving effective medical care as they participate in this war. I've seen nothing to suggest that these claims are not true. And what he is saying is in stark contrast to what we're hearing about the provision of medical services on the Ukrainian side. There have been many reports that evacuation of wounded from the battlefield is very slow and clumsy, and that by the time many soldiers, wounded soldiers, have reached the first aid stations and eventually the field hospitals on the Ukrainian side, it's too late, and that mortality rates as a result are much higher than they might have been if the medical services in Ukraine, military medical services, had been properly resourced and properly organized. Anyway, that's what Shoigu said. And then he talks about the mobilization situation. He said that a few words about the autumn conscription campaign. This is the regular campaign in which the Russian military calls up 18 and 19-year-olds in order for them to conduct their 1-year compulsory service in the Russian army. He says that started on 1st October. The minister emphasized that it was taking place as planned within the time frames laid down by Russian law, and 130,000 young people are to be subjected to compulsory military service. And he went on to say the head of the military department pointed out once again that all conscripts, including those from the new regions, in other words, from Donbas, Zaporozhye and Kherson, will not be sent to the combat zone. And Shoigu went on to say the general staff, Gerasimov, who's the overall commander, and the general staff has no plan for additional mobilization. The armed forces have the necessary number of troops to carry out the special military operation. This is largely due to the resolute patriotic attitude of Russian citizens who are actively involved in helping to defend the fatherland. And of course, that is perhaps true, but it's also the case that Russian contract troops are now paid very well in Russia and receive very generous social provisions. So this is, materially speaking, an attractive form of service. And then Shoigu went on to say that since the beginning of the year, over 335,000 men have signed up for military service under contract and in volunteer units. More than 50,000 citizens signed a contract in September alone. Now, that would suggest that the number of young men or men enlisting is actually increasing, and it's not difficult to understand why. With the levels of casualties falling, with the medical services apparently in the rear, apparently organized effectively, and with the Ukrainian offensive now either ended or ending, depending on what, if anything, the Ukrainians try in terms of this much discussed assault across the Dnipro. With all of that happening, service in the military is now becoming increasingly attractive, and I suspect that quite a lot of young men, perhaps now feeling that victory cannot be that far away, are anxious to enlist in order to be part of it and in order to be part of history in the making. This, of course, on top of the various financial and other benefits that I discussed before. So it certainly looks as if the Russians are going to be able to meet their mobilization target of 400,000, or rather their contract target, their call-up target for contract soldiers of 400,000 by the end of this year. In fact, if Shoigu is right, and if the pace of increase continues, if 50,000 men enlist in October, November and December, then the Russians will have significantly exceeded it. Now, in my program yesterday, I mentioned that there are reports that the Russians are now starting to feed reinforcements into the battlefronts, that apparently 10,000 additional troops have been sent to the Bakhmut area, and that the forces in the north, the 25th Combined Arms Army, which has been pushing towards the Oskol River, has received another 4,000 troops, the equivalent of another brigade. And given that these 400,000 men have not all been enlisting at the same time, some of them will have been enlisting at the start of this year, back in January, and probably even before, it's likely that we're starting to see some of the troops that enlisted at the beginning of the year now having gone through their training, or at least the bulk of their training, being carefully introduced into the battlefronts. Apparently, one of the things that militaries do when they have the time is that they usually train up their troops to an acceptable level. Then they expose them to a certain amount of fighting to basically get them used to what fighting looks like. And then gradually, as the troops harden and gain in experience, then of course they can be properly committed to a proper offensive whenever the time for that comes. And that does seem to be, overall, the Russian approach and the Russian plan. Again, methodical, incremental, make haste slowly, festina lente, to use the Latin words. That seems to have been the approach that the Russians have been taking ever since they came to accept in the summer of last year that a negotiated settlement of the war would not happen anytime soon, and that the only way to achieve a satisfactory outcome in this conflict in Ukraine was to prepare for it methodically and thoroughly, and to mobilize all Russia's resources, its military industrial resources, its human resources, in order to achieve a full victory. So that seems to me where we are at the moment in the military situation. We still have this, as I said, this uncertainty about the Ukrainian build-up in Kherson region, west of the Dnipro River. And as I've said, it might be that the principal purpose of this build-up, apart from giving the soldiers some sort of rest, though I would say if so, it's not much of a rest, because the Russians have been busy launching bombs and missile attacks on these troops in their assembly areas. So quite a lot of them must be facing enormous pressure from this Russian aerial campaign. Anyway, even as that is all going on, apart from that tantalizing thing about this Ukrainian build-up on the west bank of the Dnieper, which might have no other purpose than to cause us to speculate and wonder about what might still be in store. Apart from that, I think we can say, up to this point, that the offensive, now at the end of its fourth month, is essentially ending, or ended, and that it has been a complete failure. Now, this is starting to have political consequences. I discussed yesterday, over the course of my video yesterday, in which I discussed the various comments that have been made by various British officials, Admiral Radakin, in his extraordinary, in my opinion, delusional interview with War on the Rocks, Ben Wallace, in his equally delusional article in the Daily Telegraph, which, by the way, slipped out the admission about Ukrainian soldiers on the front lines, their average age being over 40. Average age being over 40. Anyway, and of course, Grant Shapps' reckless piece of kite flying, his suggestion that British troops might actually be deployed in Ukraine itself, ostensibly to train Ukrainians, and that the Royal Navy might undertake some kind of role to escort Ukrainian grain ships. Anyway, I said that part of the purpose behind all of this was to shore up support in the West for Ukraine as the offensive, the much hoped for offensive, the much hoped for breakthrough that so many people in the West, President Biden, President Zelensky, of course, the Ukrainians, Western leaders, Chancellor Scholz, all of those people have been desperately hoping would achieve some kind of breakthrough. Anyway, I said that these British comments are intended to shore up support for Ukraine, given that the failure of the offensive now means that this support is starting to flag. And in fact, we've had some very interesting comments that all but confirm this from Gabby Hinchcliffe in The Guardian. Guardian, of course, has been the most fervid supporter of Ukraine within the mainstream British media, which is saying a great deal, by the way. Anyway, over the course of this article, we read things like the following. We have a discussion about the fact that Ben Wallace, when he tried to get Rishi Sunak to give a further £2.3 billion British taxpayers' money to Ukraine just before he resigned this summer, Wallace apparently has written that the most precious commodity of all is hope, and it is Britain's duty to keep those hopes of victory alive by stumping up. It's quite an interesting thing. British must continue to feed hope to the Ukrainians, and that of course means giving them money, more money. And then Gabby Hinchcliffe goes on to say British politicians have been privately worrying about how to shore up support in Washington for the war since at least early spring, amid rising resistance on the Republican right and suspicions that Donald Trump will turn off the tap if he wins the next presidential election. And then there's a lot of talk about the United States and the fact that support for Ukraine is cooling. But then there's an admission that support for Ukraine might be cooling in Britain as well. And this comes at an earlier point in the article. This is the Gabby Hinchcliffe article. You can feel the fatigue descending now like heavy autumn mist pooling in the bottom of a valley, a sort of strange public torpor quietly smothering the high emotion of the early days of the war. Having leapt too quickly at the assumption that Kiev couldn't possibly hold out against the mighty Russian army, British public opinion then swung wildly towards what has turned out to be an equally unrealistic idea, namely that plucky Ukraine could somehow achieve a David and Goliath victory over the rusting superpower within that year. We could put up with one winter of rocketing gas prices. Surely, if that was the price to be paid for peace in Europe. Only now it's the second winter of not daring to turn on the central heating, and the stories emerging from the front line are no longer of Ukrainian farmers cheerfully towing away stranded tanks with their tractors, but of a grinding war of attrition that could last up to a decade. Well, you don't have to agree with Gabby Hinchcliffe's account of the fighting and her reproduction of some of the early myths about the war to say that she's probably accurately charting the shift in public mood here in Britain. And interestingly enough, she also says that similar views to those in the United States, similar doubts, are filtering through the political undergrowth in Britain. Nigel Farage asked viewers of his GB News show earlier this year whether Britain has now given too much to Ukraine and risks leaving itself defenseless. And we could see that the mood is shifting even in Britain. And the article ends, Wallace is not alone in seemingly fearing that support may start to unravel as times grow tougher. Conservative Party members love a bit of patriotic tub thumping on defence at conference, but if they have to choose between tax cuts at home and supporting someone else's war overseas, well, would you bet Europe's future on that outcome? So, we read from Hinchcliffe about the debate that's going on in Britain. I said yesterday that the British government almost certainly receives soundings all the time about the mood from the British public. There's a dearth of opinion polls, by the way, about whether or what people in Britain feel about the war in Ukraine. And of course, the ones that are published perhaps carry a health warning with them. It seems overall that the mood is declining. The support for the war amongst the British public is falling. And at one and the same time, there's doubts starting to grow even amongst the British political class. And the British are also worried about flagging support amongst their allies, including the United States. And this is why we have these extraordinary articles from interviews and articles from people like Radikin and Wallace. It's essential, apparently, to keep hope alive. The most precious commodity of all is hope. That was by Ben Wallace. And it is Britain's duty to keep hopes of victory alive by stumping up. All I will say is the real duty in war is to tell, if not the truth, at least the reality of the situation. Because if people are not being told the truth, or at least the reality of the situation, then inevitably bad decisions are going to be made. And that has been the story, not just of this war, the one that started in February of last year, but of the entire conflict altogether, going back all the way to 2014 and beyond that. We would not be in this situation we are in today, where Ukraine is exhausted, its army is apparently in a bad condition. I discussed yesterday in my program the growing reports about desertions from the Ukrainian army. We don't, by the way, hear any reports of desertions from the Russian army, at least not on any significant scale. And of course, Ukraine running out of equipment, ammunition. I noticed, by the way, that the latest German aid package to Ukraine didn't include any new weapon systems at all. It did include all kinds of other useful things, medical equipment and special spectacles and that sort of thing. But the only actual munitions that were included was 40 caliber shells. At least that's what I understood, presumably in order to try to defend against drones and such things. But anyway, that lack of ammunition, lack of equipment to send to Ukraine, all this situation could have been avoided had people in the West been more realistic, had a better understanding of what the overall situation in Ukraine was like. And by the way, on that topic, there has been a brilliant article by Ambassador Chas Freeman, one of our guests on the Duran. Glenn Deason and I have been privileged to interview him. Anyway, Ambassador Freeman has charted the whole course leading up to this disaster. He has shown how the United States and Western governments took provocative steps at every turn, assuming that the Russians, when they made clear their opposition to NATO's eastward expansion, were essentially bluffing, and that the Western powers took no heed of Russian warnings. And of course, when the war did begin, they assumed that the Russian government would rapidly collapse under the weight of the sanctions and in the face of Ukraine's defenses. And of course, that didn't happen either. And the result is that we're now looking at a debacle with the Ukrainian military that's burnt up, largely burnt up and exhausted, Western weapons largely burnt up, ammunition supplies exhausted, a Russian army that's building up steadily in strength, Russian military equipment increasing all the time as production in Russia rises, a Russian economy that is proving extremely resilient in the face of sanctions, and a juggernaut, a Russian juggernaut likely to be let loose in Ukraine probably sometime next year, with Ukraine probably unable to resist it for very long, and Western governments most probably unable to do much about it. And on the topic, by the way, of Western sanctions, a couple of days ago, there was this very interesting admission from Janet Yellen, who was the inventor of the price cap, the $60 a barrel cap on Russian oil. She said that the cap on Russian oil has not been working as well as the West intended, with Moscow's ability to create shadow services for its oil shipments and after the rally in crude prices. It does point to some reduction in effectiveness of the price cap. And you can read all about her comments on Bloomberg. They're all behind Bloomberg's very tough paywall. I'm not going to analyse it further, although I'll read out from it further. But that was basically what it said. It does point to some reduction in effectiveness of the price cap. Price cap has all but collapsed, as I've discussed many times. The Russians, apparently their earnings from energy are now back to normal levels, perhaps even higher. Their budget is moving back towards surplus. That entire idea of choking off the Russians by choking off their oil and gas revenues was at the same time ensuring that oil and gas revenues, especially Russian oil, oil exports, remained at acceptable levels. That whole half-baked plan, even Janet Yellen, its original creator, is now grudgingly admitting that it has failed. So, all of this could have been avoided. All it required is some reality, some understanding of the realities of the situation in Ukraine, of Russian feelings about NATO, about the eastward expansion of NATO, Russian feelings about Ukraine itself, and indeed about the entirety of the former Soviet space. But of course in the West, nobody wanted to talk about that. Nobody wanted to take that seriously. They all had other plans, engineering regime change in Moscow, breaking up Russia, isolating China from Russia, all these things, and we can see that we are now heading towards a debacle. Well, I get a general sense of exhaustion. As I said a few weeks ago, there's lots of talk in the media on the sidelines about a freeze of the conflict. There were all those diplomats, ex-diplomats going to Moscow trying to talk to the Russians about this. There were articles appearing about it in journals like Foreign Policy and Foreign Affairs. One hears a lot less about this now. I think that the complete uninterest in these ideas from the Russians is probably starting to hit home. And of course, Zelensky himself can't realistically adopt this plan, because if he did, he'd have people like Budanov, his intelligence chief, coming after him. So one hears less about this now. One hears less about negotiations, in fact, altogether. I get a sense of exhaustion and demoralization, both in Ukraine and in the West, on all sides. There's less talk about supporting Ukraine to the bitter end. One does hear the words "as long as it takes" still conjured up occasionally, but with less and less conviction. There's less funding, despite all of the maneuvers in the Congress. I've already explained that they don't necessarily prevent Congress authorizing funding for Ukraine. It's quite likely that funding will eventually be organized, though if Representative Gantz does achieve his objective of unseating House Speaker McCarthy, then of course the situation might change. Gantz is likely to be far more hostile to continued funding for Ukraine than McCarthy is, and indeed it might indeed in that case be truly the case that funding for Ukraine might stop. But first, of course, Gantz has to unseat McCarthy and has to be elected Speaker, and we're not there yet. But even if an aid package is passed, it will probably quietly fade. It will probably not be on the scale of the funding that was provided before, because equipment levels in the West's arsenals are now at such a reduced level that realistically there's little more, apart from a few ATACMS missiles, that can be sent. So I get a sense of a general exhaustion, little desire to commit further to continuation of the war, little desire at the same time to engage the Russians in serious negotiations, just a kind of fatalistic acceptance starting to gather strength across the West that what comes will come, with perhaps a few Western leaders fully understanding the implications of what a strategic defeat for the West might actually mean. It's a grim and dismal prospect. Meanwhile, the Russians, for their part, continue to take various steps. They have now announced that as of the 1st of October, all use by banks in Russia of the SWIFT interbank payment system for financial transactions within Russia itself are outlawed. This has been made absolutely clear by the Russian Central Bank, and before 2022, before the 2014 crisis even more, all Russian interbank transactions, including transactions between Russian banks, were conducted through SWIFT. Today, none are. The expectation in the West that disconnecting Russia from SWIFT was going to be the nuclear option, that it was going to create total collapse within the financial and banking system, that would lead to a huge contraction in the Russian economy as the Russian banks were no longer able to process and receive and make payments. Well, that proved completely wrong. The Russians, of course, had their own payment system, the financial messaging system, the SMS, as they call it, and that simply stepped in and took over. As, by the way, before the war began, I warned would happen if the disconnection from SWIFT took place. Well, it did happen. And now, to the extent that any Russian banks continue to use SWIFT for payments within Russia, transfers of funds within Russia itself, that has now completely stopped. And that is consequential because the United States has used SWIFT to keep track of money movements in various countries around the world. And with this change, they're no longer able to keep track of money movements within the territory of one of their most important adversaries, that one of the two most important adversaries, in fact, within Russia. So they don't know any longer where the Russians are moving their money around within their country and within their own economy. And that has denied the United States a key source of intelligence about Russia. So that's one big step that the Russians have taken. Professor Jeffrey Sachs, another person who we have been privileged to interview many times now on the Duran, he's done a further piece in which he's pointed out that whatever fears people may have about this new world of digital currencies that is coming, it does almost certainly, given how many countries are now working on developing digital currencies, it does effectively mean that SWIFT is soon going to become obsolete anyway, and that the world controlled by the Western financial system and the dollar is going to end Well, I invite people to look at that article. I think it's a most interesting one. And in the meantime, we're also getting further news about Russian military developments. It seems that a few weeks ago, the Russians brought their massive, extremely powerful Sarmat intercontinental ballistic missile into service. This is the most powerful intercontinental ballistic missile in the world. Well, this is now, I think, relatively old news, but there's been reports circulating now that the Russians are about to start tests, airborne tests of their new MiG-41 high-speed interceptor. Can apparently fly at more than 3 times the speed of sound, perhaps even faster than that, and has the ability, it seems, to launch hypersonic missiles. Well, we see whether all these claims are true. But anyway, supposedly, this missile is now about to be, this aircraft is about to enter flight tests. And there's also a scattering of reports that Russia is again about to conduct a test launch of the Boristovnik nuclear-powered cruise missile. Now, this is one of the most tantalizing weapon systems mentioned by Putin in a speech about Russian weapon systems that he gave back in the spring of 2018. It's been apparently a rather troubled program, unsurprisingly, given its complexity. You would have thought that having a kind of jet engine operated by a nuclear reactor would be a challenging task, even for a country like Russia. But anyway, it is apparently again about to be tested. We'll see whether that test is more successful or not. I find all of these developments most ominous. They suggest that we're now once again involved in an arms build-up. The Cold War is back in earnest with a vengeance. The Russians are now producing not just more weapon systems, but new weapon systems and new strategic systems. And the Chinese, of course, are doing the same. And there's many more nuclear powers than there were during the period of the Cold War. And all of this, it seems to me, is the product of America's massive strategic mistakes, of which the Ukraine conflict was the greatest, which took place in the aftermath of the Cold War. Anyway, that is my rather bleak end to today's video. We see that the offensive, Ukraine's offensive, barring some attack, last-ditch attack across the Dnipro, now seems to be essentially at an end. The Russians are continuing their build-up. The West is exhausted and demoralized and has no idea, no plan about what to do, but seems to be instead drifting along, waiting to see what happens. There we are. That's my program for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day. And just to remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals and Rumble, and of course also now the former X, rather the X, which is the former Twitter. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. You can check out our shop. Buy yourself the amazing things that you will find there: our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, please remember, if you've liked this program, to tick the like button, to check your subscription to this channel. And anyway, that's me for today. Have a very good day, and more from me soon.